Hi, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Well, it was finally the moment we have all been waiting for, closing arguments in the Michelle Troconis trial. Did the attorneys bring it home? And how long until the jury comes back? We're going to cover all of that in the next hour. I hope you are having a great Tuesday. Welcome into the live stream. I know people are coming in off the commercials, so welcome. Glad you are all here tonight. We have been waiting for this moment for 6 solid weeks. We have been waiting to hear what the jury will do. I'm waiting for closing arguments, really, to put the case together because there were no opening statements. One of the problems has been that it's been difficult to understand sometimes where the parties were taking the arguments. And we've talked about that. We did our own exhibits here on the channel so that it was a little easier to understand, but the jury didn't always have that. So the question is, how did the attorneys do today? And the answer is they were absolutely excellent closing arguments today, I felt like. It has, I think, been difficult up until now for the jury, but they absolutely brought it home. All three attorneys who did the closing arguments did great. They hit exactly the points they needed to, brought the whole case together. I thought it was really a superb day from a lawyer's standpoint. We are extra heavy on video tonight because I wanted to show you what they did. So please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And remember that we'll be going live again tomorrow at 7 p.m. I want to throw up Melody Wooster. She was the first super chat for the night. And I totally agree with what she said. She said, well, that wasn't the one I meant to throw up, but I also want to thank Melody Wooster, who said that she's watched every minute and day of the trial and she's going to miss it. I want you to know, Melody, you don't have to miss it. We go live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on the channel at 7 p.m. Eastern. So you can show up on other days. We may not be covering the Michelle Troconis trial, but we cover tons of other really interesting cases, all the biggest legal cases in the news. And the next two we're going to be going to, some people asked me last night, we are so behind on the Corey Richins case and on the Delphi murders case. And there is nothing more unusual in the country than the Delphi murders case. And we'll be hitting both of those. Those have just gone wild, and we have so much to cover on those. But meanwhile, let's head back to this. And thank you, Melody. I really appreciate the super chat. Patricia said that the defense attorney, John Shohorn, brought out some really good points. And coincidentally, she was very impressed with the prosecutor's style. I completely agree with that. They did really well in very different ways, as the defense and the prosecutor should do different in different ways. And so we will cover that and we'll talk all about it. So, short version of what happened today. We had 30 minutes from the prosecution. Then we had an hour from the defense for closing argument, roughly 30 for the prosecution. It was a little bit less. And then 30 minutes again for the prosecution. So the prosecution bracketed the defense. And Shohorn did a really good explanation of that. He said, you may feel like it's unfair, which I don't know if anyone actually did, but he said that's because they have the burden of proof. So I thought he brought it home really well to explain why it was that the prosecution gets to go around him in the middle. And then there was the jury charge from the judge. The jury began deliberations. I think it was a little less than an hour, and the judge sent them home for the day, and they will start again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Now, quick overview of the case if you're new coming in, and we've got tons of videos so you can catch up over time. But in essence, Michelle Troconis is the defendant. She is accused of conspiring to murder her boyfriend's wife. The boyfriend and the wife had been separated nearly 2 years at the time that Jennifer Dulos disappeared. A mom of 5, dropped the kids off at school and just vanished. At that point, Michelle Troconis, according to the prosecution, Fotis Dulos, the husband of Jennifer, killed her, murdered her, and he did it in a conspiracy with Michelle Troconis. She's the one on trial because Fotis is not around anymore to face trial. So she's the only one on trial. So let's get started with some of the testimony. We're going to start with Michelle Manning, who is one of the two prosecutors who handled really, I would say, pretty much half the case. She went off she started off the closing arguments and did about half an hour. I'm going to give you just a short excerpt of hers, and then you'll see.
Start by talking about one thing that the evidence shows. Jennifer is dead. Let's be very clear. She was murdered on May 24th, 2019. There's blood spatter throughout the garage, throughout the undercarriage of two cars, footprints and swipes of blood. Her blood-soaked shirt and bra thrown out in the garbage on the streets of Albany Avenue, along with zip ties, sponges, and duct tape. Jennifer did not run away from her family, her friends, her 5 children, as the defense would like to believe. This trial is about.
So that was throughout the case, is sort of a specter that hung over it. The question of, is Jennifer Dulos really dead? Because there's no body. And Michelle Troconis told law enforcement repeatedly in the interrogations that Fotis Dulos said Jennifer had run away as a younger person. She'd run away for several years, didn't tell her parents where she was, changed her name. So leaving the question, did Jennifer Dulos really die or did she run away? And I think the prosecution gave an excellent argument here for why it's difficult to believe that Jennifer would run away from her 5 children, especially given that she was in such a difficult custody battle over the 5 children. And she was, at the time, the only person who had physical custody. Fotis did not. He had only supervised visitation.
Frustration of Fotis Dulos not seeing his kids for over a year and a half, about not seeing his kids and having a supervisor present for a year and a half. And every time those kids came around, Michelle Troconis had to leave her home. She had to take her daughter somewhere else. But that light at the end of the tunnel, I submit to you, wasn't another court hearing, because there was a court hearing and nothing changed. As of Wednesday, May 22nd, Fotis Dulos still had to have a supervisor present. Nothing changed. So they were gonna make it change. After all, why would they be toasting at a dinner party on May 23rd? Why were they happy, excited, if nothing had changed? Because they were going to make it change the next morning.
So the prosecutor is talking about the fact that Fotis Dulos was talking about saying that things were really turning around for him in terms of the custody proceedings, although he only had supervised visitation because of a new report that had come out, and that has become a controversy in the case as well. But because of this new report, we weren't shown it. We don't know exactly what it said, but he seemed to believe it was really favorable for him, that it suggested that Jennifer could not care for the children and that maybe he would get custody. And the prosecutor here is arguing that really wasn't going to happen, or at least not as quickly as Fotis Dulos wanted it to happen, because there had actually been another hearing even after this report and nothing changed. There wasn't a switch in the roles as to who got custody. There were still more proceedings. So maybe Fotis was really frustrated and it had been building up for a while. The dinner party she's referring to was a dinner party that Michelle and Fotis had at their home the night before Jennifer disappeared. And everyone there testified that it was a pleasant, ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary. They didn't seem particularly tense. And the defense believes that's evidence that there was nothing going on, that they weren't plotting a murder. They couldn't have just been calm and collected the night before if they'd really been plotting a murder. But the prosecution is saying, well, maybe the reason they were so happy is they knew they were about to take matters into their own hands. So I also want to say thank you so much to Squinting Cat and Cindy Johnson for gifting Lawyer Lee memberships. Thank you for doing that. And we've been having a ton of fun. Membership is a way to financially support the channel. You can do 2 other things that really help. totally for free. You can hit the like button on the video and you can subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you back for more, so please do both of those. And thank you to Squinting Cat and Cindy who are supporting it financially. We really do appreciate that. All right, let's keep listening.
During this entire morning, Fotis Dulos doesn't have his phone on him.
And I should probably give a little context for you. She is now going to be talking about the day that Jennifer disappeared, when the prosecution believes he drove his employee's truck down to New Canaan, about an hour and 20 minutes south, murdered his wife, and then drove back to his home in Farmington, to where he lived in Farmington. So the prosecutor now is going to be talking about whether or not Fotis had his phone on him, because we know he didn't, and she'll talk about why and what happened.
Why wouldn't he want his phone on him? Well, she doesn't want his location tracked. But 2, he needs somebody to manipulate it at 4 Jefferson Crossing so it looks like he is home. We all know who that someone is. Michelle Troconis.
So the prosecutor, I thought, of all the elements that got brought home today that really weren't covered as well in the trial, I thought this was the most important. I thought they really put together the fact that when Michelle Troconis was at home that morning, it wasn't just that she answered that one phone call from the Greek friend that the prosecution believes was calling solely to set up an alibi for Fotis Dulos. There was also a lot of manipulation of the phone, picking it up, moving it around. And the prosecution says all of that was a plan, was an intent by Michelle Troconis to try to convince people that Fotis Dulos was at home, when in fact he wasn't. He was out committing murder.
The defendant traveled with Fotis Dulos to Hartford to dispose of the evidence. The coordination that after they have been sitting there a while, they open the door at the exact same time, conveniently at the right time to block the view from the tan car waiting to exit the parking lot. She wipes gum off of her hands onto the city sidewalk. Is that reasonable? Or is it more reasonable that they didn't want anybody in the tan car to see Fotis Dulos dispose of those altered license plates in the sewer? As for the evidence that was tampered with, you have them. The license plate, the bloody ponchos, the gloves, the tool, the bloody towel, the mop, the zip ties that were cut, and her shirt, and her bra sliced down the middle. Don't forget the bag that contained the defendant's DNA on the opening. That bag also contained blood-like stains and duct tape, and that duct tape had Jennifer's DNA on the sticky side of it.
So they have, in a short bit, summarized that super important evidence about the drive around Hartford, where Fotis Dulos stopped the truck, pulled black garbage bags out of the pickup truck bed and threw them in trash cans around Hartford. And she summarized, here are all the things we found inside that. And we know, because she admits it, that Michelle Troconis was sitting right beside Fotis Dulos. So I pulled out these sections for you so you can get a flavor of what the prosecution said in that first half hour. Now I want to switch over and talk about what the defense said.
We also concede that something bad did in fact happen at 69 Wells Lane in New Canaan that morning. It's clear, and we will also concede, that Fotis Dulos is ultimately responsible for what happened to Jennifer Dulos, whether he did it himself or he had a compatriot who was involved in it down there.
So the defense acknowledged that something bad happened at 69 Wells Lane. They didn't perhaps acknowledge the death of Jennifer Dulos, but they did acknowledge that something bad happened at Jennifer's house. That's what 69 Wells Lane is. At this point, then the question is whether or not Fotis Dulos was actually involved in that. And they agree, they admit, they say that he was ultimately responsible for it, but they leave open the question of whether Fotis Dulos himself committed the murder, and leave that question open.
Custody fight was about to end. There was a favorable report. Everyone said that report was favorable to Fotis Dulos and that he was going to look forward to spending the whole summer with his children. Everything was consistent with the testimony by friends, his co-workers, his employees and former employees, and especially the lawyers that you heard from, Mr. Meehan and Mr. Rose. This nefarious plot under those circumstances makes no sense. Why then? Why at that moment is he going to then plot with his girlfriend to kill Jennifer? Why at that moment would Michelle agree to risk her life, risk her daughter's entire family life to at that point say, I think we now want to get rid of Jennifer Dulos? It doesn't make sense.
And throughout the case, the defense has made the point that Fotis Dulos was really excited and happy about that report that came out and was convinced everything was turning around for him. In other words, this wasn't the time, it wasn't the moment that he would choose to kill his wife. That is, of course, the reason why the prosecution will say Michelle Troconis put that report up on her computer, blown up big in the courtroom, even though it was under seal and was not something that was allowed to be shown to anyone. It wasn't even clear how Michelle got a copy of that document. So did she have it before? Had Fotis given it to her? That was unknown. Was it really the report? Isn't even known for sure. But what is known for sure is there's going to be a contempt hearing. The judge was extremely upset about it. And some photographs taken at the time, if you blow up the photograph and look at it through the video camera, there were enough words on it that it did appear to people who had seen the report to be potentially the very report. And here it was, Michelle showing it. But why would it be so important to her? It's because it supports, I assume, in her mind, this argument that there was reason for Fotis Dulos to be optimistic and to be convinced that he was going to regain custody at a minimum, 50%, that he was going to be with his kids again. I have lots of people to say thank you to. I want to thank Robert Bates and Jennifer Jansen and Tom23. Thank you, all of you.
Things from Michelle, just like he did from his friends and from his employees, including Pavel Gumieni. He did that for years. He told Pavel to find a replacement for it. He also told him to replace the car seats in that Tacoma.
Let me give a little more context. I cut brutally to try to make this short enough to fit into this. So sometimes if I cut out some of the context, I'll try to throw that in. The prosecution believes that Fotis didn't take one of his own vehicles down in New Canaan. Instead, he drove his employees' red Toyota Tacoma, and they found what they believe is photographs of it, video of it from rest stops and from a bus that was driving through New Canaan. And they believe they were able to track it down to New Canaan. They think even though it was the truck that belonged to the employee wasn't driving it. It's pretty clear the employee was driving another vehicle that day. So who was driving the red Toyota Tacoma? The prosecution says it was Fotis Dulos. And so what they're talking about is after the vehicle was driven down there, apparently the prosecution believes that Fotis and Michelle wanted to destroy the evidence of that. And so Fotis told Pavel Gumieni, look, I want these seats. And I first of all tried to get him to sell the car. And when that didn't work, said, I want these front seats gone. Let's replace them with some other seat. So that's what the discussion is about.
Fotis told him to call seats, if he called him on the phone, hardware. What is this, some kind of spy code? Why would Fotis tell Mr. Gumieni to not refer to it as seats, but hardware? Who would be present at that point? Michelle or perhaps other employees? He didn't want them to know. Despite all these red flags, doing all these things, after Fotis told him he wants them to do this because there may be some of DNA of Jennifer in his vehicle. He does it anyway, even with full immunity from prosecution, which the judge will talk to you about. He still insisted to you in questioning that he did not believe that Fotis would harm Jennifer. He knew more than Michelle did, and he still did his bidding.
I thought this was one of the most effective arguments that the defense made in the closing. They argued that person after person got up on the stand and said, I knew Fotis for years. It would never occur to me that he would kill his wife. That was certainly a surprise to me. And we had numerous people, including Pavel Gumini, the owner of the red truck, the employee, who got on the stand and said that. And the argument of the of the defense was, okay, if all of his friends were shocked, stunned that he would do that, why? Why then would it be a surprise that Michelle didn't expect that and didn't believe that that would happen? She was as surprised as they were, and you can see that from what the other people did in context.
Michelle, yes, was in the Raptor when he dumped those garbage bags on Albany Avenue. And the police thought Michelle knew what was in them, but she didn't know. And there's no way you could see without X-ray vision what was in those bags.
So the defense started a series of arguments related to the biggest and most important pieces of evidence in the case. With respect to those trash bags, what they've said is Michelle may have been sitting beside Fotis, but she had no way of knowing what was in the trash bags in the back. She had no way of knowing that what was sitting inside those bags was bloody clothing with Jennifer Dulos's DNA.
Michelle wasn't trying to replace anybody. She didn't want to be these children's mother. She loved these children. She liked these children, but that's a far cry from wanting to replace their mother. Yes, there was a toxic custody battle, but she thought things were working out in her favor.
So that echoed what I thought was a pretty effective argument somebody had made in one of the comments on the channel, on this channel here. Someone said, is that really something she would want? Does she really want to be? She's had all this time, one child who is now in middle school. Does she really want to add 5 where she's the sole parent? Is that something she would want? She did say during the interrogation that Fotis said, are you ready to be the mother of 6? And she said, sure. But I thought this was an effective argument because other people have raised it as well. Asking just the practical question, is that something she would want? The answer may well be yes, because Fotis wanted her to want that, but I thought it was a good argument.
She was upset that her 12-year-old daughter's picture was being plastered all over the internet in connection with the disappearance of Jennifer Dulos.
Which is not a surprise, right? What he's now going to relate is something that Michelle said, according to Pavel Gumini, to him, something related to Jennifer Dulos.
And what did she say, according to Mr. Gumieni? That when she shows up, I'm going to kill her. And you remember, Gumieni himself said that's what he thought too, that she was going to show up. So if she's already deceased, why would anybody say that? And
a nice turn on the argument by the defense, because up until now, the argument has really been about if she said this thing about I'm going to kill her, she was threatening Jennifer, she really hated her. The prosecution, you'll hear, echo that. They had already said it at the beginning, and then they said it again as a bracket at the end. You'll hear that. I cut out the first one because just to shorten things. But what he's saying is, that's really, although it may sound threatening, it's also evidence that she still thinks Jennifer is alive. And if she is in a conspiracy to murder her, why is she saying when she gets back, I'm going to kill her? That would only make sense if she really thinks Jennifer is alive and is going to get back.
Suggestion by the prosecutor that, well, there's some DNA on the faucet, and we should assume that means that Fotis Dulos was in the house. Remember, it was a mixture between Jennifer Dulos's DNA and Fotis Dulos's DNA. It's the only place in the house. Why would his DNA be there other than she took chocolate from him, she took a cake from him, the children all had touched his hair, they were playing basketball with him, and where else would they wash their hands before dinner but on the faucet in the kitchen? Otherwise, what are we supposing here, that if it was Fotis Dulos, he took off his gloves, touched the faucet and then put his gloves back on, his now maybe bloody gloves back on, walked out the door so it wouldn't be anywhere else. That's what doesn't make sense.
So I segued straight into another argument that was made. One of the prosecution's strongest arguments is that Fotis Dulos's DNA was found on a faucet inside Jennifer Dulos's house. Now, that might not have been that unusual, except for the fact there was testimony by numerous people that Fotis wasn't allowed in Jennifer's new home. He had never been inside it, and therefore, how could his DNA have gotten on the faucet? How could it have gotten on the doorknob going into the home? How was that possible unless he was there to murder Jennifer? And so the defense is arguing that on a practical level, they don't think that would be possible because it doesn't really make sense, as you just heard, the taking off of the gloves and so forth. And now he's going to start just a series of questions about some of the evidence from the prosecution.
There's also the fact, what are we going to do about getting a body or an injured woman? What is he going to transport her on a bicycle? Remember, where they saw the red pickup truck was about 300 yards, if I recall the testimony. It's up to you, not my memory, from where they found the Suburban. On a busy road, Lapham Road, in front of, near the entrance to one of the biggest parks in this area, a public park on Memorial Day weekend on a nice day, that nobody would notice anything.
And he's hitting all of the points that have worried us throughout the case. We've asked a lot of these questions. For example, the prosecution never found the body, law enforcement never found the body. How did it get moved from Jennifer's Chevy Suburban, which was left by the park there that he's referring to? How did that happen? How did it get to the truck that he was driving, that red pickup truck? They weren't parked right beside each other. We know that from the bus video and then from where her vehicle was found. So how did it happen? What was the actual technical way that it occurred?
There was a question raised about whether or not that Bluetooth connection of the phone belonged to Jennifer Dulos, or maybe it was the kids, maybe it was Lauren Almeida. But at this time, at 2:56 p.m. in the afternoon, when that Bluetooth connected to her Suburban, they were long away in New York City. So we know it's not them. But we have more than that. We have the Stratford police research that shows, if you look to the right there, sometimes.
So the argument was, and like I said, he's going to go through a series of things, and I have cut them really brutally so we can cover as many of them as possible in our time together tonight. But one of the strangest facts was the connection to Jennifer of a phone with Jennifer's phone number to the Bluetooth in her car as it sat there, presumably as it sat there beside Waveney Park in New Canaan. How did that happen? If Jennifer's dead, and if Fotis Dulos has for hours now been in Farmington, an hour, 20 minutes north, how does that happen? How does her phone connect to her Suburban? We know he points out that the nanny wasn't there, her kids weren't there, and this was a phone that not only was known to it, therefore would have to be one that had connected to it before, but also he pointed out the defense put on some evidence that showed it was actually Jennifer's number that connected. So how did that happen? Who had the phone down there? And he raises some excellent questions that have plagued people throughout the case.
They were mistaken, sort of like the 30 stops when it was only 3. You heard Kimball admit that was a mistake. He admitted a few times in answering questions, especially by Mr. McGinnis, those were mistakes. But the difference is those mistakes were under oath. He swore to some of these things. If a private person does that, they'd probably get arrested and charged with perjury or false statement. For him, it's just a mistake. For Michelle, if she makes a mistake or misspeaks, it's a crime. Deception is an interrogation tactic in Connecticut, and you heard police are allowed to lie, they're allowed to deceive, but when they're threatening a person to go to prison, maybe for many, many years, she's going to lose her family, she's going to lose her child.
So one of the most important pieces of evidence for both the prosecution and the defense was the series of 3 different interrogations of Michelle Troconis. The prosecution thinks it's important because they believe she lied. There was a clear progression, they believe, in what she said, and she said different things by the third interrogation, different from what she had said in the first two, and certainly in the first one. The defense believes that it shows that she was being attacked, basically, by the law enforcement who were interrogating her, and they were giving her false information, questioning her about things she would say, when in fact she made it really clear that something happened. They would say, "You're wrong, and we have proof that you're wrong." And sometimes law enforcement was wrong. So he's saying, when you look at this interrogation, it really is, it looks unfair. And the false statements that law enforcement made are deemed just totally fine. Whereas when Michelle Troconis said anything wrong, that wasn't just a mistake. It was an intentional lie done to cover up murder. And now they're going to talk about one of the questions we had asked repeatedly here on the channel, which is, how did Fotis Dulos get from the house where he lived with Michelle to the place where the prosecution shows the red pickup truck pulling out? We know that Fotis Dulos had a work site that was only 5 minutes from his house. He was a high-end home builder, and he was working on a home just 5 minutes away. The prosecution showed the red pickup truck pulling out of that home at about 5:30 in the morning on the day Jennifer Dulos disappeared. There was testimony that truck had been taken to the house the night before. So how did Fotis get from the dinner party in his home to that house in the morning if the red pickup truck is what was being driven? Did he drive a car? Because Michelle said she thought the cars were there. So how did it happen? And he's going to talk a little bit about that.
Time that Michelle went upstairs to her daughter's room, and you see the Tacoma leave 80 Mountain Spring at 5:30 in the morning, there's nobody traveling on those, or there's no pedestrians, there's no bicyclists, there's no other car, nobody, not a taxi, nobody dropping somebody off.
So one of the questions that I thought somebody might ask, but nobody talked about, is if, in fact, Fotis Dulos was at 80 Mountain, was at his home at 4 Jefferson, and he was going to leave from 80 Mountain Spring, which is what the prosecution believes. Why? Why did he need to do that? If Michelle was in on everything, if she was part of the conspiracy, why couldn't he just leave from his house? Why did he need to leave from another home? I thought that was somewhat confusing, but that question did not get asked. I will say.
You do know somebody else was in New Canaan,
which is where Jennifer was.
That was Pavel Gumieni,
the employee.
He claimed he was there all day. But first of all, you'll remember what Mr. Newt said. That dot on the lower left-hand side means that the truck was parked behind the house. He had told you he always parks in the driveway, except that day. When I showed you the video from across the street, you don't see any vehicle at all. But Newt testified that the truck started up at 12:30 and then is not seen again till 4:21. Coincidentally, that's exactly in the middle of the time when the Bluetooth shows up and attaches to Jennifer Dulos' Suburban at 2:56 in the afternoon. Just enough time to travel the 80 miles up from New Canaan back to the Plainville area, which is right next to Farmington. Then you see him at the gas station. Talks about his Chinese restaurant that he went to. Can't remember where it is, what he ate, or even if he was alone. And he deleted all of his searches. The police got his phone. He deleted that he had been looking at flights to Poland. He deleted that he was looking up about the disappearance of Jennifer Dulos. And he deleted all of his search history and messages from Memorial Day weekend. Michelle didn't do any of those things.
Throughout, there has been a question of Pavel Gumieni's involvement. He was initially named as one of the people potentially a conspirator, at least one of the people with information. And I mean, law enforcement named him as that. The prosecution named him as that. He was given immunity. So he did not have to, he did testify, but he could not be prosecuted for any crimes related to this. So the defense is going straight to the question, Was Pavel Gumieni involved? Maybe instead of Michelle Troconis, maybe he was the person who was actually connected to what happened. He was down there in New Canaan as part of his work. He was actually where she was. It didn't require something unusual for him to be down in New Canaan. Fotis wouldn't have normally gone down there, but it would have been very normal for Pavel because he was assigned to one of the homes that Fotis's company was building down there. And so maybe all of these things suggest he was involved.
Michelle told the police, even when they insisted, when they told her that science proved that Fotis couldn't be home, that she did think he was there. She knew he had an appointment with Kent Mawhinney, and sure enough, Kent Mawhinney was there that morning. And she kept telling the police she thought he was there, and they told her they would walk out and charge her with accessory to murder. And here's a different question for you to ponder. If Kent Mawhinney was a co-conspirator and he was there, why not have him pick up the phone? Or better yet, if Michelle was the co-conspirator, why have Mawhinney there in the first place?
So he's referring to the fact that Michelle did answer the phone from the Greek friend and saying, why is it necessary to have both of them there? Couldn't just one of them be a sufficient alibi if that's all they needed?
Now, why would he agree to let a house be shown to strangers
that is.
on Saturday morning early if he's using that house as a staging ground for destroying of evidence? I don't know, getting rid of clothing, getting rid of a body, whatever the state is claiming is going on at 80 Mountain Spring Road. That makes no sense. It makes no sense at all.
And it is true, and he pointed this out, that the state went over 80 Mountain Spring, that work site just 5 minutes from Fotis's home, went over it with a fine-tooth comb. They had dogs looking. They went over it with metal detectors and anything they could think of that would give them insight into whether or not Jennifer's body was there, and they found nothing at all. So he's saying, if that's what he was going to do, is cut up a body there, do something, destroy the body in some way, why is he letting people come the very next day for a showing at that house? That doesn't make sense.
If you go to the garbage bags on Albany Avenue and you look at those, you also can speculate what could not have been burned. You could burn garbage bags, you can burn ponchos, you can burn cloth, you can even burn sponges. Why not do that? Those are the items that would be, quote, incriminating.
And I'm cruising through this, so I know that some of you are like, wait, it's too fast. But I was trying to just cram as much as I possibly could into this. One of the biggest arguments that the prosecution has was that they saw smoke coming out of the chimney at the home where Fotis and Michelle lived during the day, at a time when only Michelle was at home, that she was going back and forth to this 80 Mountain Spring work site. She was coming back, and at one point she started a fire, and then later on there was another fire. Why? The prosecution said, do you need a fire on May 24th when it's reasonably warm outside? And one of the practical arguments the defense makes is, well, if they're burning something, what is it? And why didn't they burn all that stuff that they then threw out in New Canaan? Why did they not burn sponges? And why didn't they burn the ponchos and the cloth? That would have been something that would have been smart to destroy. Instead, they didn't burn any of that, and they actually found the entire bloody shirt, the entire bloody cut bra. They found those things in the trash cans in Hartford.
And I just want to play, that's going to be the last thing. I'm going to play that clip from she never said that she picked up gum.
So let me go ahead and give this a little explanation, because I think we're going to jump into it too fast for most people. So I did, like I say, cut brutally to try to fit it all in. So one of the things that we saw was that moment in time when Michelle and her attorney stepped out of the interrogation, and we had sitting in there law enforcement, 4 different people who were part of law enforcement, and the state's attorney in charge of the prosecution for their region. And so the state's attorney says during the middle of this, I don't know, you'll hear, but maybe she doesn't know. He says that a couple of times, and the law enforcement members tried to convince him otherwise. And ultimately, of course, she was prosecuted.
Here's the state's attorney, the chief law enforcement officer for this judicial district, saying she doesn't know. Maybe she doesn't know, and you've got the 3 detectives telling him something that's false to get him to come off the notion that she doesn't go. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, if he thought she didn't know, then that's reasonable doubt right there.
Very, very powerful argument, I thought. I thought that was a really good one. At the same time, though, the prosecution came back for a very powerful final 30 minutes. And we started off with just a question, what do you really think happened here? And he asked a good question.
Doubt that Fotis Dulos is responsible for the death of his wife? Do any of you doubt that he was in New Canaan on May 24th, 2019, murdering his wife? How else would he have had her bloody bra, her bloody shirt, blood all over the bags, his DNA in a glove found inside the trash? How?
Super compelling. And it is ultimately the argument, but as Michelle's lawyer was quick to point out during his time, that's an argument that Fotis Dulos was involved. The state still has to connect Michelle Troconis. It's not enough to say Fotis murdered his wife, but this is very powerful evidence that happened.
Defendant hated Jennifer Dulos.
That means Michelle.
She referred to her as a bitch who should be buried next to the dog. She referred to Jennifer Dulos as a manipulator. She said, "You people are toxic," referring to Fotis Dulos and Jennifer Dulos. She said that since she moved to Connecticut, it had been 2 years of torture.
That's a quick summary of all of the ways that they believe that Michelle talked about Jennifer Dulos in a way that showed she was angry enough, the prosecution thinks, to participate, to conspire with Fotis to murder her. And remember that there are other charges too. This is not just murder. There are also the charges that Michelle tampered with evidence and hindered the prosecution. Those charges are also being considered by the jury.
And I also just want to say this, and I don't quite know where this fits in. That's for you guys as the fact finders to decide. There's something unsettling about the defendant and Mr. Dulos fooling around on the passenger side of that Tacoma on May 24th, 2019. The defendant...
That was indeed a strange piece of evidence. She testified that Fotis wanted to have sex on the side of the passenger side of the Tacoma. And that is where they actually found some DNA of Jennifer Dulos. The defense says, well, that's because she had been in in Pavel Gumini's red pickup truck before when he took her to the vet. There's nothing strange about her DNA being there, but the prosecution says the reason her DNA is there is because some part of her murdered body was there, or at a minimum, bloody items were there, and that's why it had the DNA.
In this case, repeatedly lied to investigators. Repeatedly lied to investigators.
So when I go to the bathroom, I brush my teeth, I get into the shower. I don't wet my head, usually because I take a fast shower to take me going. Fotis jumps into the shower with me.
Now, here's what's interesting about that. She is giving the investigators an awful lot of detail, isn't she? I didn't wet my hair. Fotis jumped in the shower with me. And of course, we know where that came from. This is what she told investigators about where Fotis Dulos was on the morning of May 24, 2019. I saw Fotis talking to Kent in the office.
I walk, Kent, the lawyers there. They're talking in the further, have you been in the house now?
Just explain it.
They're in the table down the office.
They, Kent and who?
And Fotis.
Kent and Fotis?
I grab my computer.
All these details. He's talking to Kent at the table in the office. I grab my computer.
I thought that was a really powerful argument. I thought that was really well done because she had tons, even things like, I don't usually wet my hair. This is exactly what happened. I can tell you where everything was sitting. I can tell you what I grabbed. And yet, there were things that how could she have gotten all of those details correct and yet have forgotten just the few most important things? I thought this was a really well done argument. And we are about to go into what I thought was the single quickest sentence to really get into why the prosecution doesn't buy her expert witnesses. It was very strong, and I'm going to play that for you, but I have a few people I want to thank. I want to thank Robert Bates very much. I appreciate that. Denise Parker, Gopo, Lily B, Jody Arrington, Shy Gal 8, who gifted 5 Lawyerly memberships. Thank you. And Carol, and Creative Chaos, and Armchair Apothecary. Thank you, everybody. So here it is, the one sentence. You'll be really impressed.
Her lies were so profound that the defense brought in 2 experts to try to explain them away to you.
Just bam, in one sentence, really did some damage to what those 2 experts did. I thought that was really powerful. Now let's hear a little more about what he said about that.
We talk about language proficiency. We talk about why she may have said the things that she said. If that's really what's going on, why is she so good on details that don't matter? And so bad on details that incriminate her? Why? She even told the police, if you'll recall and you watched the interview, that when she went up to Starbucks, she tried to order a chocolate croissant and they were out. That's the kind of detail that she provided. And yet when it comes to things that incriminate her, language gap, memory gap, you exercise your common sense. Is it really just a
really good argument there. So I am going to give you I think it's like a 3-minute clip that I thought was so good. I just thought, let's just leave it all together and you can hear it and evaluate it for yourself. This is a segment that came lifted straight from what the prosecution said, and you will hear it.
A bunch of coincidences? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant answered Dulos' phone at 4 Jefferson Crossing when he was murdering his wife in Canaan? Is it just a coincidence that Dulos' phone is being moved and manipulated when only the defendant is home? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought cleaning supplies to 80 Mountain Spring Road where you know the cleanup of its coma was going on? Is it just a coincidence that the call from Greece is not in the defendant's timeline? Is it just a coincidence that during the cleanup, only hours after Jennifer is murdered, the defendant is shuttling back and forth between 4 Jefferson and 80 Mountain Spring Road? Is it just a coincidence during these trips back and forth, the defendant starts a fire at 4 Jefferson Crossing? Is it just a coincidence that during these trips back and forth, the defendant starts a second fire at 4 Jefferson Crossing? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant eventually lights a third fire at 4 Jefferson Crossing? Is it just a coincidence that while Dulos is cleaning the Tacoma, she takes a brown stained paper towel from him and throws it in the trash? Is it just a coincidence that despite no one telling her to, she took the keys to the Tacoma? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant travels with Dulos to Hartford as he disposes of the evidence on the same day? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought black garbage bags to 80 Mountain and Jennifer's shirt and bra were found inside black trash bags? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought a green and yellow sponge to 80 Mountain Spring Road and 2 of those were found in the trash in Hartford? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought a broom and the police found a mop or a broom handle in the trash at Albany Avenue in Hartford? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant opened the door to the Raptor at the exact moment that Dulos exits the vehicle to dump those license plates in the sewer and block that other vehicle's view? Is it just a coincidence that despite her daughter not being home, the defendant panicked when the police came to the house, went to 3 separate rooms and said, "I don't want to be here"? By the way, if the police come to someone's door while their child is not home, would you expect a reasonable person to immediately go to the door and make sure the child is okay? Unless, of course, that person just knowingly committed a crime. Is it just a coincidence that the defendant followed Fotis Dulos to the car wash and then tried to lie about it? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant's phone number and not Dulos' number was used at the car wash? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant lied and said she showered with Dulos when he was actually en route to murder his wife? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant lied about seeing Dulos in the office again while he was in New Canaan, murdering his wife? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant initially denied seeing Dulos' phone on the morning that Jennifer was murdered? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant said she saw Dulos meeting with Kent Mawhinney at 4 Jefferson Crossing around the time of Jennifer's murder, the same information that was in Dulos' timeline? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant never mentioned starting a fire to the police until they confronted her in the third and final interview? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant failed to mention that the Tacoma was at 80 Mountain Spring Road during her first 2 interviews? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant never mentioned that Dulos had washed the Tacoma during her first 2 interviews? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant answered the one call mentioned in Dulos' timeline on that morning as having been answered by him on the morning of his wife's murder? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant failed to tell police that Fotis Dulos' bicycle was at 80 Mountain Spring Road until the third and final interview? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant lied about not going back to 80 Mountain Spring Road to return those keys? Is it just a coincidence that Dulos told Pavel Gameney to keep the defendant, quote, out of this when Gameney brought up the defendant taking his keys? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant's DNA was found on the opening of a garbage bag that also contained bloodstains, tape, and Jennifer Dulos' DNA? Are all these things just coincidences? Or is the defendant guilty?
Really, really powerful as far as the ending. Well done. Well done. And as I said, these were absolutely excellent closing arguments, I felt like. I felt like they brought it together. They put out the best arguments for their side. I thought it was just absolutely fabulous. And now it is your turn. What are you thinking? If you are a member, then give me as you know, if you're a member, we have special emojis that you can use in the chat, and we use those to communicate back and forth. So I am curious, what are you thinking? If you think it's looking pretty bad for Michelle Troconis, put the scared emoji in. If you think it's looking pretty good, you think she has a real chance of being acquitted, put in the prayers emoji. So do those two, and we will see what happens. It'll be sort of an informal poll. And if you're not a member and you don't have those emojis, that's totally fine. We love having you here on the channel. And just put a 1 in if you think it looks like the prosecution is doing really well, and a 2 if you think, I think Michelle is really doing pretty well. I was convinced by some of the doubts raised by the defense. So that is what we'll do. I'm also about to go over and take a few questions. We've gone kind of long tonight, so I don't know if I'll be able to take as many as usual, but I will take some. If you're going to do a question, it really helps me spot them if you put question marks at the front end so I can easily look at it and see what they have. So, and also we will be doing I don't know if pool is the right word, a poll, that's probably the right word, over on the community page. So be sure you hit the subscribe button and you'll get notification of this, at least I think you do. And so the poll is going to be, how long do you think that the jury's going to be out? And I'm about to give you a few clues, and you can take these and decide what you think. In closing, the prosecutor suggested that the jury go back and listen to the interviews of Michelle Troconis. That alone would take more than 2 days. That was 3 different interviews, and they were long. And she also suggested that they watch some other videos as well. Plus, the jury asked for an easel. So it seems to me that they really do intend to seriously look at the evidence. Even so, how long is it going to take? Will they be back tomorrow, 2 days from now? You think it might be longer? I'd be interested to hear. So we'll do a poll and just kind of guess. You can just guess. Nobody has any idea. We'll just have to wait and find out. But I really do think it's important and great that they look at all the evidence. And the reason I feel like that, I mean, it is a murder case. Conspiracy to murder, it's of extreme importance. And so I'm glad to hear that it sounds like they really want to look at the evidence and give some real thought to all of that. So I want to start off with a question that we had a while back from Tracy. Do you think that Michelle knows where Jennifer is and will pull that out if the jury comes back guilty? Tracy, it is a good question. Would she have some information she could use to try to negotiate her sentence downward or negotiate a plea after the fact? Here's why I don't think so. They gave her every opportunity to do that, and she showed up 3 times trying really hard to give them everything they wanted that she had. So my guess is that either she doesn't know or she will never tell, whichever whether you believe she's innocent, then she doesn't know. She'd have done it if she possibly could have. If you believe she's guilty, then she's holding out, and I don't think that part's going to change. And let's see. The Smith fam asked, local here. Local. I've gotten so many emails. I really appreciated those from people from the area, and y'all have given me a lot of good information about where things were, how busy the road was, about the pond where the skiing occurred, things like that. If Michelle was clueless in Hartford, I like that, clueless in Hartford. That'd be a good title, wouldn't it? Did police ask if she asked Fotis why they went that far to go to Starbucks? Many Starbucks are closer. Can't answer that. She did say that they were going into Starbucks and they passed it. And she was like, hey, we just passed Starbucks. And he was throwing out these trash bags and she wasn't really paying much attention. So they did even pass by it to throw out some of these things and then stop by on the way back. So I don't know if there was another one that was closer, whether she asked. I don't remember hearing anything about that. Maybe they had been to this particular one before. Okay, so I'm going to head over and look for some of the questions and try to see how far back they go. Okay, so I'm looking at some of the emojis. We've got, I see a scared. I see lots of different ones. Let's see, a 1, a 1, 1. Oh, a lot of ones. Haven't found a 2 yet. 1 is prosecution. 3 days. Oh, people are putting in their estimates. So 3 days. All right, I got a bunch for 3 days. Okay, this is 2, a 1. 2 days, 8 to 12 hours. Wow, this is all over the place. So it'll be fun to do our poll. Be sure to check out the community page and give me your answer on the poll as to what you think. So I'm trying to go back and find about where we started on the questions. And I'm just going to stop here because it looks like there were plenty of questions below this. So Trudy thinks there will be a guilty verdict. That's not technically a question, but she put question marks at the beginning. Joe, how is it fair that the state had 20-something days to lay out their case and the defense gets 1 hour to summarize its weakness? So I'm not going to fight you on that, Joe, because I thought 1 hour was too short. I really did think that was not enough for the defense. And at one point you heard him say, okay, I'm out of time. I'm going to leave out that stuff and get back to this. So I thought he did a really good job with his hour. I thought 1 hour was too short. I thought it should have been longer, and just my opinion. Michelle asked me, Michelle got mad, other Michelle, not this Michelle, got mad after the dinner party because Fotis always speaks about Jennifer and their issues that fueled the fire. So I think, again, that's more of a comment. Yvette, if Michelle is convicted, what chances will an appeal look for her? There are a number of issues that they can talk about on appeal. There is the question, for example, of the decision not to let in that report that she believes would help her, that report that was done on custody and on whether or not Jennifer could care for the children. We don't know a lot about what that says. We're sort of guessing because it's just been referred to. Supposedly Fotis thought it was great. It was really going to help Fotis, but we don't know, frankly, a lot about that. So we have a lot left to figure out and learn about that. And hopefully, but I think that might be one issue that there would be on appeal. There were some other issues related to evidence that came in or didn't come in. Usually that's a heavy place to go for appeal, is evidence, because that makes or breaks the case and whether or not it comes in. So I think that all could come in. One of the interesting decisions made won't be on the appeal, and that was the decision to play the entire interrogations, all 3 of them. Apparently, the 2 sides agreed to that. That was pretty unusual, and a whole lot of evidence came in that might not have come in otherwise. Michelle's comments about what Fotis had told her about what other people said and things like that. All of those came in because they played them in their entirety, but they agreed to that. So that was, I think, one of the reasons. Paul wanted to know about whether I don't know anything about that, Paul. So I'm not gonna read that. I unfortunately can't answer that. Didn't hear anything about that. Although Paul may have been referring to, there was no, I just don't know. Sorry, I'm not going to read that because I don't know anything about that. Bossy Texas Chick says, have you seen an entire trial not prove guilt and then have powerful closing and get their conviction because of it? I do think that happens. And I think if it were to happen, it would happen here because of the fact that it took that long for the state really to pull the case together without the roadmap from the front of the opening statements. It was sort of up in the air trying to understand some of what they were saying. And I think that it does happen. Usually, I would say that people begin to make up their minds or have an opinion much before that. I don't really think opening argument is the final decision maker most of the time, but it's not impossible. And a powerful argument is there because it's designed to persuade. So that is exactly it. So Bridget wants to know, even though there's a lot of coincidences, does there have to be definite proof? Which is a really good question, and one that the judge talked about some in the jury instructions. What the jury has to find is that the state proved every single element of every single claim, let me rephrase that. For each claim, the state, in order to find Michelle guilty, the state has to prove every single element of that claim beyond a reasonable doubt. How can they do that? Well, one way would be with circumstantial evidence. So there doesn't have to be a video of the murder showing that person committing the murder and Michelle standing alongside saying, yeah, go for it, for there to be a conviction. It doesn't have to be that strong. Instead, there can be proof that consists of things that are circumstantial, but that taken in context allow the jury to make the decision beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that was definitely something they spent a lot of time talking about. And that was part of what those jury instructions were and that were so important. So Tess says, who decides where the cameras go in the courtroom? Can you set a timer for a phone to come on? So I don't know anything about what you mean about the timer, but the cameras, who decides where they go is the court. And you will see wide variety. If you watch the Murdaugh trial with us, then you saw that there was a camera in front trained on Alec Murdaugh. So you saw his every facial movement. There were people who went online and analyzed his facial expressions. We see something sort of similar with Corey Richins, maybe a little not as focused as with Alec Murdaugh. On the other hand, in the Koberger case, the judge made some very specific rules about where the camera could look and how long it could look and what kinds of pictures could be taken. So that is up to the court to decide where and how that will work. And one of the things in this particular court, there's been a single camera, and it's often an angle kind of behind Michelle Troconis and the parties, and only occasionally is Michelle shown, and it's always from the side, so we rarely get a good view of her, and certainly no expression during the testimony. So, okay, let's see what else. Other questions. Okay, Andrew Allen wants to know, can you explain again why the prosecution got 2 bites? Yeah, and here's the reason for that. The prosecution, traditionally, they carry the burden of proof. This would also be true in a civil case between the plaintiff and the defense. So the plaintiff would be allowed to go first, or the prosecution, because the plaintiff bears the burden of proof and the prosecution bears the burden of proof. They go first, then the defense goes, and then you have a second try. There's a second go round where either the plaintiff or the prosecution gets to go again. And the idea is they bear the burden of proof, so we'll let them have the last chance to explain that to the jury. They got the exact same amount of time. Each got 1 hour, but it was divided into 2 pieces for the prosecution. It was a single long shot for the defense. Brianna wants to know, could Kent strike a deal if he tells where Jennifer's body is? So I would say that either Kent has not yet struck a deal, Kent Maywinnie, and there was talk that he would come and testify at trial. He didn't. He didn't show up at trial. He didn't testify. It came back that he would be taking the Fifth Amendment and would not speak, so he would not come and testify. Which technically he could have come and then taken the Fifth on the stand, but the prosecution didn't put him up at all, stating that he intended to take the Fifth Amendment. I think, Brianna, that if he had been going to take a deal, he would have taken a deal to come and testify at Michelle's trial. And for whatever reason, whether it be that the offer wasn't strong enough or that he didn't have enough information to provide and the prosecution wasn't willing to make a deal, he elected not to do that, or the prosecution elected not to do that. Isaac wants to know, do you think she's guilty? So Isaac, I have said I'm going to wait until the jury comes back before I give my 2 cents, and I want to give everybody a chance to kind of form their own opinions and see what they think. Moose wants to know, is it typical for a judge to give a reason which way he will go each time an objection is raised? Very much not, in my experience. That was very unusual for anything I've seen before. And he not only gave a reason, but he talked through what had just been said by the witness and what the objection was and what the response to that was, and then gave his answer, which sometimes had the effect of emphasizing what the question was, which if he was going to overrule it and if he was going to, sustain the objection and not allow the testimony, created, I thought, a few more people were able to, it made it more noticeable, even though he was saying that it wasn't going to come in. Lauren wants to know, Jennifer knew Fotis was dangerous and unpredictable. Why did she play hardball with him? And why not have security cameras on her home? Can't answer that, Lauren. Those are all questions that I think would be that people would wonder about, but I don't know the answer. I do find it absolutely surprising that neither Fotis nor Jennifer had cameras at their home. It does seem like a big surprise given how huge these houses were, how expensive they were, that they would not have had cameras. There was some testimony which did not come in at trial about Fotis having asked about, or did it come in at trial? Sorry, I can't remember whether I read it beforehand or later, about Fotis having asked whether or not Jennifer had cameras at her house. I think that did come in, and having done some reconnaissance work basically to figure out whether she had cameras and whether or not they would be working. The implication being that he would have done that because he was going to try to get away with murder and wanted to know. So I think we'll take like 2 more questions. And I think that we have over here. I want to thank Jackie very much, as well as Joe Teef. Thank you very much. I appreciate your super stickers. Thank you. So we'll do like maybe 2 more questions and then we will call it a night, but we will be back on tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern, whether the jury comes back or not. We go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, but we have plenty to talk about because I cut out so much from this, even though it was very fast paced, I cut out so much from this closing, and I have so many things from Michelle's interrogation that I still haven't covered. So we have a great deal to cover. So let's see. Patty wants to know if I thought it was distracting for the defense lawyer, the female lawyer, to keep handing a note during closing, because there was a period of time when she came up and handed a note. I think this is just my theory. I think he wanted to know how much time he had. And she was saying, you've got 20 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. So go ahead and hit this next point. So he had asked about, at one point, he even turned around and said time, because he only had an hour and he wanted to know how much time he had left. That was my theory about why they were asking. So last question, this is from Susan. If the sealed report was going to turn the custody battle around, why would the defense concede at the beginning that Fotis is responsible for the disappearance or death of Jennifer Dulos? Indeed, that does seem a little contradictory. There was one thing that they suggested. That is really a good point because, and the prosecution sort of pointed out that they made different arguments, the defense did. They kind of argued both directions. They said, for example, that they agreed that Fotis was responsible, whether he did it by his hand or not. But they suggested that maybe Fotis truly was at the house all morning, that the only reason Michelle changed that story was because she got so much pressure and insistence from law enforcement that she changed that story, that really he was there. Implication being maybe he hired someone or paid someone to kill Jennifer. If he was still responsible, there you have it. But of course, he did have those bloody clothes. There was a very unusual story floated by his defense attorney around the time of his being charged, that someone had dropped off the bloody items on his doorstep and that he threw those out as just because he didn't know what to do. When he saw these bloody items, he threw them out. There would have been a problem with that argument, I think, because he threw those out before he got the word that Jennifer was missing. So I think it would have been a little bit hard to explain that, but that never really got fleshed out since, of course, he's no longer alive to tell us more about that. So thank you to everybody. I so appreciate the super chats and the super stickers. Thank you a ton. I will see you tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern. Prosecution showed it to jury, and so you can get a pretty good look at it too. Red blood-like substance on it. He said it was even wet and leaking everywhere. That was a quote. Zip ties, a razor blade. Why were these items there? And in the back window is a bobblehead of Alec Murdoch going back and forth.